The great hall smelled of pine smoke and something sharper testosterone dominance, the kind of scent that made my wolf whimper and retreat deeper into the corners of my mind. I stood near the back wall, fingers twisted in the rough fabric of my dress, watching the gathering unfold with the same sick fascination one might watch storm clouds roll in before a hurricane. Every unmated wolf in the territories had been summoned. Not invited, summoned. When the Lycan king calls, you don't politely decline. The marble floor beneath my feet was cold, even through my worn boots. I'd polished them this morning, scrubbing away months of mud and neglect, trying to look like I belonged here among the daughters of alphas and betas. Girls who moved through the crowd like they owned the very air they breathed. Their hair gleamed under the chandelier light, honey blonde, raven black, copper rayed, all of it perfectly styled. Not like my own pale strands that I'd barely managed to braid into something presentable. "Stand straight," my sister Vivian had hissed at me before we'd entered. "For once in your life, don't make us look weak." Weak. The word had followed me since childhood, since the day my wolf had first emerged. Small, silver-furred, with eyes too large and a howl too soft. Not like Vivian's wolf, all golden power and alpha blood. Not like anyone's, really. I watched the king from across the room, and my breath caught despite myself. He stood on the raised dais, surrounded by his personal guard, and he looked exactly like the rumors promised, massive, dark-haired, with features carved from granite and eyes that could strip flesh from bone with a glance. Valyrian Shadow. The name alone made wolves across 3 territories drop their gazes and bare their throats. He'd taken the throne at 19 after his father's mysterious death, and in the 7 years since, he crushed rebellions, conquered rival packs, and remained utterly, impossibly alone. No queen, no mate, no weakness. They say he killed the last woman who tried to claim him, someone whispered nearby. I didn't turn to see who. The gossip had been circulating all week, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said he was cursed. Others said he simply had standards no she-wolf could meet. A few whispered darker things, that he loved once, and that love had destroyed him so completely he'd rather rule alone than risk it again. I didn't know which story was true. I only knew that his gaze was currently sweeping the room with the methodical precision of a predator selecting prey, and my heart was hammering so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. "The king will speak with each of you individually," announced his beta, a scarred wolf named Gale whose reputation for brutality preceded him. "When your name is called, you will approach. You will answer his questions honestly. You will not waste his time." The first name rang out. Celine Brightwater, a stunning blonde, real blonde, not mousy pale like me, glided forward. I watched her curtsy, watched the way she tilted her head to expose her throat in submission while somehow still managing to look seductive. The king spoke to her for less than 30 seconds before dismissing her with a slight gesture. She returned to the crowd with her head high, but I saw the tremor in her hands. One by one they were called. One by one they were dismissed. I tried to quiet my racing thoughts, but they spiraled anyway. What was I even doing here? I wasn't like these women. I didn't come from powerful bloodlines or carry the kind of strength that could stand beside a king. I was the overlooked daughter, the one whispered about in disappointed tones, the one whose own pack barely acknowledged her existence. My father had made his feelings clear when the summons arrived. "Don't embarrass us," he'd said, not even looking up from his desk. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut." The memory still stung. Arya Ashford. Why name? For a moment I couldn't move. My legs had turned to stone, my lungs to ice. Then Vivian's elbow connected with my ribs sharp, impatient, and I stumbled forward on numb feet. The crowd parted like water, and suddenly there was nothing between me and the dais except 30 feet of polished marble and my own thundering pulse. I forced myself to walk steadily, even though I could feel hundreds of eyes on my back, judging every step, every breath. Up close, the Lycan king was even more terrifying. He towered over me by at least a foot, all broad shoulders and coiled strength barely contained by the formal black jacket he wore. His hair was dark as midnight, pushed back from a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't so severe. But it was his eyes that caught me, pale gray like ice on a frozen lake, and just as deep, just as dangerous. "Name," he said, though he obviously already knew it. "Arya Ashford, Your Majesty." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Small miracle." "Pack." "Silverpane, Your Majesty." "Rank." I hesitated. This was where it always fell apart. "My father is the pack's lead healer. I assist him." Something flickered in those cold eyes. Not quite amusement, but close. "You're unmated." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" The bluntness of it startled me. Around us, I could feel the attention of the entire room focusing like a blade point. This was the question that had haunted me for years. The one my pack asked with their silences and sidelong glances. The one I'd asked myself 1,000 times while lying awake at night. "I don't know, Your Majesty." The truth felt like failure on my tongue. He studied me for a long moment, and I fought the urge to drop my gaze. Something told me he'd consider that an insult, or worse, proof that I was exactly as weak as everyone said. "Do you have a mate?" he asked. And there was something strange in his voice now. Something that made my wolf stir for the first time since entering this hall. The question seemed redundant after what we just discussed, but I sensed the weight behind it was different somehow. He wasn't asking if I was mated. He was asking if I had someone somewhere waiting for me. Someone I belonged to even without the bond sealed. "Not yet," I whispered. The change was instantaneous. His entire body went rigid, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The gray eyes that had been merely intimidating moments before now blazed with something I couldn't name. Something wild and possessive and barely controlled. "Not yet," he repeated, his voice dropping to a growl that vibrated through my bones. "Explain." I blinked, confused by the sudden shift. "I only meant I'm not promised to anyone, Your Majesty. There's no arrangement, no understanding. I'm unmated and free." "Free?" he said, as if testing the word. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "You consider yourself free?" Yes. It came out as a question, because I genuinely didn't understand what I'd said wrong. He leaned forward slightly and I caught his scent. Pine and snow and something darker, like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. "And if someone were to claim you, if someone were to decide you belong to them, would you still consider yourself free then?" My heart was racing again, but differently now. There was a challenge in his words, and beneath that challenge, something that almost sounded like jealousy. "No, that was impossible. I would belong to my mate," I said carefully, "when the bond chooses." "The bond?" He cut me off with a laugh that held no humor. "Tell me, Arya Ashford of Silverpane, do you believe the bond is always right? That fate knows better than we do who we're meant to stand beside?" It felt like a test. Like every word I spoke was being weighed and measured against some standard I couldn't see. "I believe," I said slowly, "that the bond can surprise us. That sometimes strength isn't what we expect it to be." The words came from somewhere deep, from the part of me that had spent years being overlooked and underestimated. The part that had learned to find power in gentleness when the world demanded claws. For the first time since I'd approached the days, the Lycan King's expression shifted. The rage, or whatever that fierce emotion had been, didn't disappear, but it changed into something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Step back," he said quietly. I obeyed, retreating 3 paces as protocol demanded. But as I turned to rejoin the crowd, I heard him speak again. So softly that I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Not yet," she said. "Not yet." The dismissal should have been a relief. I should have been grateful to escape those ice-gray eyes and return to the anonymity of the crowd. Instead, I felt the weight of his gaze follow me across the marble floor like a physical touch, burning between my shoulder blades with an intensity that made my wolf pace restlessly beneath my skin. "What did you say to him?" Vivian grabbed my arm the moment I reached the back wall, her nails digging through the thin fabric of my sleeve. Her perfect features were twisted with something between curiosity and accusation. "He looked at you like..." I've never seen him look at anyone like that. I don't know what you mean. The lie tasted bitter. I knew exactly what she meant, because I'd seen it too. That moment when something had shifted in his expression. When the cold king had cracked just enough to reveal something raw underneath. You did something, she insisted, shaking me slightly. Arya, if you've somehow insulted him, if you've made our pack look. I answered his questions. I interrupted, pulling free from her grip. That's all. Just like everyone else. But it wasn't like everyone else. And we both knew it. The procession continued. More names called, more women dismissed. But now there was a tension in the air that hadn't existed before. A charge like lightning about to strike. The king's questions grew shorter, his demeanor colder. He barely looked at the women who approached him, waving them away after mere seconds. When the last name was called and the final dismissal given, Beta Gale stepped forward again. The king will make his decision by nightfall. All unmated females will remain in the palace until then. You are dismissed to the guest wings. The crowd began to disperse, breaking into clusters of whispered conversation. I tried to slip away quietly to find whatever small room had been assigned to someone of my insignificant rank. But a hand caught my wrist. Not Vivian this time. A palace guard. His expression neutral, but his grip firm. Arya Ashford. My stomach dropped. Yes. The king requests your presence in the East Library. Immediately. The whispers around us cut off as if sliced by a blade. I felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward me, felt the weight of their shock and speculation and envy. Vivian's face had gone pale, then flushed with something that looked dangerously like rage. There must be some mistake, I managed to say. No mistake. Follow me. He didn't wait for agreement, just turned and began walking. I had no choice but to follow, my boots clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded too much like a countdown. We left the great hall, moved through corridors lined with portraits of previous Lycan kings. All of them fierce, all of them crowned, all of them looking down at me with expressions that seemed to ask what someone like me was doing in their palace. The East Library was nothing like the simple collection of healing texts and history books and silver paint. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations, and the scent of old leather and parchment filled the air. Late afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting golden light across reading tables and worn armchairs. And standing by the window, silhouetted against the brightness, was the king. He'd removed his formal jacket. Now he wore only a black shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with scars and the dark lines of what looked like ancient pack symbols. He didn't turn when I entered, didn't acknowledge the guard's murmured announcement of my arrival. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped in front of me, trying to control my breathing. Trying to understand why I was here alone with the most dangerous wolf in all the territories. Do you know why I called this gathering? His voice was quieter now, without the formal edge it had held in the great hall. To find a queen, I answered. It was what everyone knew. What the summons had implied without stating directly. To find a mate, he corrected, finally turning to face me. The afternoon light caught in his dark hair, softened the hard lines of his face just slightly. There's a difference. I waited, sensing he had more to say. A queen is a title, a position, a political alliance. He moved away from the window, prowling closer with that predatory grace that made my pulse spike. A mate is something else entirely. Something I've been told I'll never have. Your Majesty, I don't understand why I'm... Not yet, he interrupted, and there was that strange intensity again. The one that had flared in the great hall. You said not yet when I asked if you had a mate. As if it's inevitable. As if you're simply waiting for the right moment, the right person. I swallowed hard. Isn't that what we all hope for? That the bond will find us when we're ready? Hope. He laughed, but it was a broken sound. I stopped hoping 7 years ago, Arya Ashford. I stopped believing in bonds and fate, and all the pretty lies we tell ourselves about destined pairs. There was a story there, hidden beneath the bitterness, a wound that hadn't healed despite the years. Then why hold a gathering? I dared to ask. Why search for something you don't believe in? He stopped pacing, studying me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Because a king needs an heir. Because my council demands it. Because apparently ruling 3 territories with an iron fist isn't enough. I also need to produce the next generation of shadow wolves to satisfy the old traditions. The cynicism in his words should have repelled me. Instead, I heard the loneliness underneath it, the exhaustion of carrying so much weight alone. That's not a good reason to choose someone, I said softly. His eyes snapped to mine. No? Then tell me, what would be a good reason? The question hung between us, dangerous and intimate. I thought of my own years of isolation, of being overlooked and underestimated, of lying awake wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with me that kept the bond from forming. Choosing someone who sees you, I whispered. Not your title, or your power, or what you can give them. Just you. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor, brief but unmistakable. He moved closer. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. Close enough that his scent wrapped around me like smoke. And do you see me, little wolf? His voice had dropped to a rumble that I felt in my bones. When you look at me, what do you see? I should have said my king. Should have dropped my gaze and murmured something appropriate and safe. Instead, the truth spilled out before I could stop it. I see someone who's tired of being alone but doesn't know how to let anyone close. Someone who's built walls so high he's forgotten what it feels like to be touched without flinching. Someone who... I trailed off, realizing I'd gone too far. Someone who what? He pressed. And now there was something almost desperate in his tone. Someone who's afraid, I finished quietly. Just like me. The silence that followed was absolute. I'd crossed a line, I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. You don't tell the Lycan king he's afraid. You don't suggest that someone who'd crushed rebellions and conquered packs might be vulnerable in any way. I waited for his anger. For the dismissal that would send me back to Silverpine in disgrace. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and caught a strand of my pale hair that had escaped its braid. He rubbed it between his fingers as if testing the texture, his expression distant. My mate, he said finally, died 3 weeks before our bonding ceremony. Murdered by wolves who thought I was too young to rule, who wanted to break me before I could consolidate power. My breath caught. The rumor had been true. Or at least one version of it. They succeeded, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion now. Not in taking my throne, but in breaking something inside me. I hunted down every wolf involved, made examples of them, built my reputation on their deaths. And when it was done, when I'd secured my position and eliminated every threat, I realized I'd also eliminated any chance of feeling that way again, of being that open. I'm sorry, I whispered, inadequate as the words. He let my hair slip through his fingers. Don't be. It made me stronger, made me the kind of king these territories need. One who doesn't hesitate, doesn't show mercy to enemies, doesn't have weakness that can be exploited. Is that really strength? I asked before I could stop myself. Or is it just safer? His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought I'd pushed too far. Then, incredibly, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't completely cold either. You're either very brave or very foolish, Arya Ashford. Probably both, I admitted. This time he did smile. Barely. Just a slight quirk at the corner of his mouth. But it transformed his face, made him look younger, less like a marble statue and more like a man who might once have laughed easily, before the world had taught him not to. The bond didn't choose me, he said abruptly. When she died, I felt it snap, felt the potential of what we might have been just dissolve. I've spent 7 years certain it would never happen again, that whatever fate decides these things had looked at me and decided I'd had my chance. But I prompted, sensing there was more. He stepped back, creating distance between us, and the loss of his nearness felt physical. But when you stood before me in that hall, when you said, not yet, with so much certainty, As if you knew without question that your mate was coming. He shook his head. Something in me wanted to destroy whoever you're waiting for. Wanted to prove that you were wrong to sound so sure, so hopeful. The confession was raw, almost violent in its honesty. I'm not waiting for anyone specific, I said carefully. I just meant I believe the bond will find me someday. That I won't always be alone. Such faith, he murmured. I remember having that before. We stood in the golden afternoon light. Two wolves who'd learned loneliness in different ways, him through loss, me through never being chosen at all. The silence between us felt less heavy now, more like understanding than discomfort. Why did you really summon me here? I asked finally. He turned back to the window, his profile sharp against the brightness. Because when I looked at you, I felt something I haven't felt in 7 years. And I needed to know if it was real or just wishful thinking from a wolf who's tired of ruling alone. My heart was hammering again. Is it real? I don't know, he admitted. But I know that I want to find out. That for the first time since her death, I'm curious about something other than strategy and power and survival. He looked at me over his shoulder, and the vulnerability in his expression stole my breath. Stay, he said. Not as a candidate for queen or a political alliance. Just stay. Letting me understand what it is about you that makes me feel less cold. It wasn't a command despite his position. It was a request. Maybe even a plea. And as I stood there in the East Library, with the Lycan King looking at me like I was something precious and terrifying all at once, I realized my answer had been decided the moment he'd first met my eyes in the Great Hall. Yes, I whispered. I'll stay. The days that followed existed in a strange suspended reality, as if the palace had become its own world with rules I was still learning to navigate. The other unmated females had been dismissed the evening after the gathering, sent back to their packs with varying degrees of disappointment and relief. I had watched them depart from a window in the guest wing, Vivian's furious glare burning into me, even from the courtyard below. She hadn't spoken to me since the king's request became known. None of my pack had. The message from my father had been brief and cold. Don't fail us. No words of encouragement, no curiosity about what was happening, just the familiar weight of expectation pressing down on my shoulders. But here in the palace, I wasn't the disappointing daughter or the weak wolf. I was simply Arya. And the king, Valerian, as he'd asked me to call him when we were alone, seemed determined to understand exactly who that was. He didn't court me in any traditional sense. There were no formal dinners or carefully chaperoned walks through gardens. Instead, he invited me to places that felt private, almost sacred. The library became our refuge, where we'd sit in companionable silence while he worked through correspondence and I explored shelves filled with texts about healing herbs I'd never encountered in Silverpeen. Sometimes he'd ask my opinion on disputes between packs, listening with surprising intensity as I fumbled through answers about fairness and compromise, concepts that seemed foreign to a king who'd built his reputation on absolute authority. You think too much about what others need, he'd observed one evening, looking up from a report about territory disputes. Don't you ever consider what you want? I'd set down the botanical text I'd been studying, considering his question carefully. I suppose I've never had the luxury of wanting things. In my pack, I was always trying to be useful enough that they'd keep me around. His expression had darkened. Keep you around? You speak as if you're something disposable to them. I was. The admission had hurt less than I expected. Maybe because here in this space we'd created, the old wounds seemed to matter less. My wolf is small. I'm not a fighter. I can't shift as quickly as others, can't run as far. The only value I had was in helping my father with healing work. And now Valerian had leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. What value do you think you have now? It had felt like another test, but I was learning that his tests were never about finding the right answer. They were about understanding how I thought, what I believed, when no one was forcing me to be something I wasn't. I think, I'd said slowly, that maybe value isn't something someone else assigns to you. Maybe it's something you decide for yourself. He'd smiled then, that rare, slight curve of his mouth that I was learning to treasure, and returned to his work without another word. But his hand had reached across the table to brush against mine just for a moment, and the touch had sent warmth racing through my veins. The palace staff had noticed, of course. Servants whispered in corners when I passed, and the council members who occasionally glimpsed me in the corridors wore expressions that ranged from confusion to outright hostility. Beetagale was the worst. His scarred face would twist into something like disgust whenever our paths crossed, as if my very presence offended him. He doesn't trust easily, Valerian had explained when I'd mentioned it. He's been with me since the beginning, since the night my mate was killed. He watched me hunt down her murderers, watched me become something harder than I'd been before. To him, anyone who threatens to soften those edges is a danger. And damn I'd asked. Dangerous to you? He'd looked at me for a long moment, and I'd seen something like fear flicker in his eyes. Terrifyingly so. But it was Gale's mate, Asa, who became my unexpected ally. She'd found me in the gardens 3 days after the others had left, her approach silent despite her obvious pregnancy. She was a small woman with auburn hair and sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing. "You're wondering why he chose you," she'd said without preamble, settling onto the bench beside me. I'd tensed, unsure if this was an attack or simply observation. "I wonder that myself. Gale thinks you're manipulating him somehow, playing at innocence to trap a king." She'd said it matter-of-factly, plucking a leaf from the hedge beside us. I told him he's an idiot. Despite myself, I'd smiled. "And what do you think?" "I think Valerian sees something in you that reminds him of who he was before the darkness, before he decided that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything." She turned those keen eyes on me. "I also think you're more terrified than anyone realizes, but you're too stubborn to run." The accuracy of her assessment had stolen my breath. "He's been alone for so long," Asa had continued quietly. "We've all watched him become colder, harder, watched him choose duty over everything else because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. And then you walked into that hall and something in him woke up. It scared him. It scared all of us, honestly. I'm not trying to trap him," I'd said, needing her to understand. "I don't even know what I'm doing here. Every day I expect him to realize I'm not special, that I'm just—" "Stop," she'd interrupted firmly. "Whatever you think you're lacking, he doesn't see it that way. He looks at you like you're water and he's been dying of thirst. Like you're sunlight and he's been trapped in winter for 7 years. The words had made my chest ache with something too big to name. "Be patient with Gale," Asa had said, rising with a slight grimace that spoke of back pain. "He'll come around once he realizes you're not going to shatter Valerian the way the last loss did. And if you need anything at all, find me. The king might be figuring out how to open his heart again, but that doesn't mean everyone will make it easy for you." She'd been right about that. A week into my stay, the council had requested a formal audience with Valerian, and he'd asked me to attend. "They need to see that you're not just some temporary distraction," he'd explained, though the tension in his jaw suggested he wasn't looking forward to the confrontation. The council chamber was all dark wood and heavy tapestries, with a long table where 7 wolves sat, alphas from the most powerful packs in the territories, each one radiating authority and judgment. I'd taken my place slightly behind Valerian's chair, trying to project confidence I didn't feel while my wolf cowered under the weight of so much dominant energy. "Your Majesty," began Councillor Durius, a grizzled alpha with scars crossing his weathered face. "We've been patient, but questions must be asked. This girl from Silverpine, what are your intentions regarding her?" "My intentions," Valerian had replied coolly, "are my own business. With respect, they are the business of these territories." Another councillor, a woman named Helena with silver streaking her black hair, leaned forward. "You called a gathering to find a queen. Every unmated female of standing answered your summons, and then you dismissed them all in favor of a healer's daughter with no rank, no connections, no particular strength that we can discern." The words had been meant to wound, and they'd succeeded. I'd felt myself shrinking, felt the old familiar shame trying to surface. But then Valerian had stood, and the temperature in the room had dropped. "Be very careful," he'd said softly, dangerously, "how you speak about her in my presence." The council had exchanged glances, and I'd seen the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of risk versus necessity. "We mean no disrespect," Darius had said carefully, "but the territories need stability. They need to know that their king is making decisions based on strategic value, not sentiment." "Sentiment?" Valerian had laughed, and it was the coldest sound I'd ever heard from him. "You think sentiment drives me? I, who executed 23 wolves for their betrayal? I, who've expanded our borders through blood and negotiation? You dare suggest I'm compromised by sentiment? Then explain it to us," Helena had pressed. "Make us understand why this particular girl—" "She's not a girl," I'd interrupted, surprising myself as much as anyone else. 7 pairs of eyes had turned to me, most of them hostile, but I'd found my voice and something in me had refused to be silent any longer. "I'm a wolf. Maybe not the strongest or the fastest or the one anyone would choose first, but I'm not a child to be discussed while standing right here, or I'm not a weakness to be examined and dismissed." The silence that followed had been absolute. "You overstep," Counselor Darius had growled, his alpha aura pressing against me like a physical weight. I forced myself not to flinch, even as my wolf had whimpered in submission. "Perhaps, but if you're going to judge whether I belong here, at least have the courtesy to speak to me. Not about me." Valerian had remained perfectly still, but I'd felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in his stance that suggested he was poised to intervene if the council moved against me. "Fine," Helena had said, her sharp eyes assessing me with new interest. "Tell us then, what exactly do you bring to this alliance? What value do you offer our king that hundreds of other more suitable candidates could not?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since that first day in the library, the question that haunted me every time I caught sight of my reflection and saw nothing remarkable staring back. But standing there with Valerian's presence solid and warm behind me, I'd finally understood the answer. "I see him," I'd said simply. "Not the king, not the legend, not the list of things he's conquered or crushed. I see a wolf who's been alone so long he's forgotten what it feels like to be known. And maybe I'm not a strategic alliance or a political victory, but I'd rather be someone who sees the truth than someone who only sees the crown." The council had exchanged more glances, and I'd known my words hadn't satisfied them, probably had only confirmed their suspicions that I was naive, romantic, completely unsuitable for the realities of ruling. But Valerian had placed his hand on my shoulder, a public claim of protection that had sent murmurs around the table, and addressed them with quiet finality. "Your concerns are noted." Dismissed. Later, in the privacy of his study, he pulled me into his arms without warning, burying his face in my hair while his entire body trembled with an emotion I couldn't name. "You stood up to them," he'd murmured against my temple. "They could have crushed you with their auras alone, and you stood your ground." I was terrified, I'd admitted, my hands clutching at his shirt. "I know. I could sense your fear from across the room." He'd pulled back just enough to look at me, his gray eyes blazing with something fierce and possessive. "But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, Arya, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it silence you." And then he'd kissed me. Not the gentle, tentative kiss I might have expected, but something desperate and claiming, as if he was trying to pour 7 years of loneliness into that single point of connection. I responded without thinking, rising onto my toes to meet him, my fingers tangling in his dark hair while my wolf sang with joy for the first time in my life. When we'd finally broken apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I don't know if this is the bond," he'd whispered. "I don't know if fate has decided to give me a second chance, or if this is something else entirely. But Arya, when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to want something beyond duty, to hope for something beyond survival. I feel it too," I'd confessed. "Like I've been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for." And now, he'd finished, "Now you know." The shift happened gradually, like winter melting into spring, so subtle at first that I almost didn't notice until the warmth had already taken root. Valerian began including me in more than just council meetings. He took me to the training grounds where his warriors sparred, introduced me to the patrol leaders who protected the territory borders, showed me the intricate network of alliances and tensions that held 3 territories together under his rule. At first, the warriors had been skeptical. I could see it in their guarded expressions, the way they'd exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. But I'd never been one to demand respect I hadn't earned. Instead, I'd asked questions, learned their names, their ranks, the stories behind their scars. When one young warrior had dislocated his shoulder during training, I'd stepped forward instinctively, using the healing knowledge my father had drilled into me since childhood. The bone had slid back into place with a sickening pop, and I'd wrapped it properly, explaining how to care for it and when to shift to accelerate the healing. "You've got steady hands," the warrior, a wolf named Finn with copper-colored hair and freckles across his nose, had said with genuine admiration. "And you didn't even flinch." "I've set worse," I'd replied, remembering the countless injuries I'd tended in Silverpine, always working in my father's shadow, always invisible until someone needed fixing. Word had spread after that. When a patrol returned with wounded wolves, they'd started asking for me specifically not because I was the king's whatever I was to him, but because I was good at what I did, and I treated them like they mattered. Asa had been right. Gale had slowly begun to thaw. Not warmly, but with grudging respect. He'd even sought me out one evening when Valerian had been locked in a territorial dispute meeting that stretched past midnight. "The king is different with you," he'd said without preamble, leaning against the doorframe of the library where I'd been reading. "Softer? More like he was before." Before he lost her, I'd finished quietly. Gale had nodded, his scarred face unreadable. "I've served him for 7 years. Watched him become something harder than diamond, colder than ice. Thought it was what he needed to survive, to rule. But now I wonder if we were wrong. If we pushed him towards strength and forgot that even kings need something to live for beyond duty. You were protecting him the only way you knew how," I'd said, understanding the guilt beneath his words. "Maybe. But I've seen him laugh twice in the past 2 weeks, Arya. Twice. In 7 years before you came, I never heard him laugh once." His eyes had met mine, fierce and assessing. "Don't make me regret accepting you. Don't break what you've helped him rebuild." The warning had been clear. Hurt Valerian and Gale would tear me apart, king's protection or not. "I won't," I'd promised, meaning it with every fiber of my being. 3 weeks after I'd arrived, Valerian asked me to accompany him to the northern border. There had been reports of rogues testing the territory lines, and while it wasn't a major threat, he wanted to make his presence known. Asa had helped me prepare, lending me proper riding clothes since I'd arrived at the palace with little more than the dress I'd worn to the gathering. "You'll do fine," she'd assured me, tying off the braids she'd woven in my pale hair. "Just remember the pack wolves up north are more traditional. They might test you. Don't let them see weakness." The journey had taken most of the day. I'd ridden beside Valerian, flanked by Gale and 6 guards, through forests that grew denser and wilder the farther north we traveled. He'd pointed out landmarks, telling me stories about battles fought and treaties signed, his voice losing some of its formal edge as the palace fell farther behind us. "I used to come here as a boy," he'd said when we'd stopped to water the horses at a stream. "Before my father died, before everything changed. I'd slip away from my tutors and run these woods in wolf form for hours, just feeling free." "Do you ever do that anymore?" I'd asked, watching the way sunlight caught in the water. "Just run for the joy of it." He'd been quiet for a long moment. "No, I stopped allowing myself that kind of freedom. It felt irresponsible." "Wait." I'd turned to face him fully. "Or maybe it's what keeps you sane. Maybe that's what you've been missing. Not another warrior or strategist, but someone who reminds you that you're allowed to be more than just a king." His expression had shifted, something vulnerable flickering in his gray eyes. "Is that what you think you're doing? Reminding me?" "I think," I'd said carefully, "that we remind each other. That maybe we both needed someone who could see past what everyone else expects us to be." He'd closed the distance between us then, cupping my face in his hands with a tenderness that still surprised me every time. "I don't deserve you. You don't get to decide that," I'd whispered back. "I do." The kiss had been interrupted by Gale clearing his throat pointedly, reminding us we had an audience and a schedule to keep. But Valerian's hand had found mine as we'd remounted, and he hadn't let go for the rest of the ride. The northern pack's territory had been marked by ancient pines and granite outcroppings. Their alpha, a massive wolf named Garrett with a gray-streaked beard and eyes like flint, had greeted us with formal respect that bordered on suspicion. "Your Majesty," he'd grumbled, his gaze sliding to me with obvious curiosity. "We weren't told you'd be bringing a guest." "Arya is under my personal protection," Valerian had replied, and though his tone had been even, I'd heard the steel underneath. "She goes where I go." Garrett's pack had gathered in a clearing, at least 40 wolves ranging from elderly to young children. They'd watched me with the same wariness I'd grown used to. The "why is she here" confusion. The searching for whatever made me special enough to stand beside their king. The meeting had been tense but productive. Garrett had reported the rogue sightings, describing wolves who bore no pack scent and seemed to be testing boundaries deliberately. Valerian had authorized increased patrols and promised reinforcements if the situation escalated. But it was what happened after the formal meeting that changed everything. A child had approached me, a little girl no more than 6 with tangled brown hair and enormous eyes. She'd been limping, favoring her left leg, and when I'd knelt to her level instinctively, she'd whispered, "It hurts." "May I look?" I'd asked gently, and when she'd nodded, I'd examined the leg carefully. A sprain. Not serious, but painful for someone so small. I wrapped it with supplies from my pack, showing her mother how to care for it, explaining what signs to watch for. "Thank you," the mother had said, her eyes welling with tears. "Our healer passed last winter, and we've been making do. I can leave you with some herbs," I'd offered, and instructions for basic treatments. "It's not much, but it's more than we have now," Garrett had interrupted, and when I'd looked up I'd found him watching me with new assessment. "You're trained in healing." "My father taught me. I've been assisting him since I was old enough to hold a poultice." Something had shifted in the pack's demeanor after that. More wolves had approached with questions about wounds that wouldn't heal properly, about herbs for the elderly wolves' joint pain, about whether certain symptoms warranted concern. I'd answered what I could, made notes about supplies I could send from the palace, treated a handful of minor injuries that had been lingering too long without proper care. When we'd finally prepared to leave, Garrett had pulled Valerian aside. I'd been too far away to hear their conversation, but I'd seen the older alpha's expression soften, seen him glance at me with something that looked almost like approval. On the ride back, with darkness falling around us and stars beginning to emerge overhead, Valerian had been unusually quiet. "You're thinking too loud," I'd finally said, guiding my horse closer to his. He'd smiled slightly. "Garrett told me something interesting before we left. He said that in all the years he's known me, he's never seen me look at anyone the way I look at you. He said it was like watching someone remember how to be alive." My breath had caught. "And what did you say?" That he was right. Valerian had reached across the space between our horses, taking my hand. "Every moment with you, Arya, I feel pieces of myself coming back. Pieces I thought were lost forever when she died. It terrifies me because I know what it costs to lose someone you." He'd stopped abruptly, as if the words had gotten stuck. "Someone you love," I'd finished softly. The silence had stretched between us, heavy with the weight of what we were both feeling but hadn't yet named. Finally he'd spoken, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. Love. I've spent 7 years teaching myself not to feel too deeply, not to want too much. But then you're there in my library, or my study, or my training grounds, and suddenly I'm wanting things I shouldn't. Imagining futures I have no right to dream about." "Like what?" I gasped, my heart hammering. "Like waking up next to you every morning. Like watching you interact with my people and knowing you're mine. Like..." He'd cut himself off again, shaking his head. "Like things that make me vulnerable in ways a king can't afford." I'd understood the fear beneath his words. He'd lost his mate once, had survived it by becoming something harder, colder. Opening himself to that possibility again meant risking the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed him the first time. I'm scared too, I'd admitted. Every day I wake up expecting you to realize I'm not enough. That I'm still just the overlooked daughter from Silverpeen who doesn't bring you anything except complications and counsel complaints. He'd pulled his horse to a stop, and when I'd done the same, he dismounted and pulled me down beside him. The guards had continued ahead, giving us space, understanding without being told that this moment was private. You bring me hope, he'd said fiercely, his hands framing my face. You bring me laughter and lighten the possibility that maybe I don't have to spend the rest of my life alone in my own fortress. You bring me back to myself, Arya. Don't you understand? You're not a complication. You're the first thing in 7 years that's made sense. The confession had broken something open inside me, and I'd found myself crying not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Truly seen by someone who mattered. I think I'm falling in love with you, I'd whispered against his chest. I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, but it's not too soon. His arms had tightened around me. It's been happening since that first moment in the Great Hall when you looked at me without flinching. When you saw past the crown and the reputation and all the walls I'd built, and somehow still decided I was worth your time. We'd stood there in the forest, holding each other while the night deepened around us, and I'd felt something click into place. Not the bond, not yet, but something just as powerful. A choice we were both making, despite the fear, despite the complications, despite everything that could go wrong. When we'd finally pulled apart, his eyes had been bright with unshed tears. Whatever comes next, he'd said quietly, I want you to know you've already changed everything. The bond snapped into place 3 days later, and it happened in the most unexpected way possible. I'd been in the infirmary, a space I'd claimed as my own over the past month, organizing supplies and treating minor injuries that didn't require the palace's official healers. Asa had been there too, her pregnancy now obvious enough that she moved with careful deliberation, one hand always resting protectively on her swollen belly. You should be resting, I chided gently, helping her onto one of the examination beds. I'll rest when this little one decides to stop using my ribs as a punching bag, she'd replied with a grimace. Besides, I wanted to talk to you about something. Before she could continue, shouting had erupted from somewhere in the palace, urgent, panicked voices that sent ice through my veins. Gale had burst through the infirmary door seconds later, his face pale beneath his scars. It's the king, he'd gasped. The rogues, they were a distraction. There's been an attack. He is. I hadn't waited to hear the rest. My feet had carried me through corridors I'd learned by heart, following the scent of blood and the sound of chaos. The throne room doors had been thrown open, and inside, Valyrian had been on his knees, surrounded by his guards with blood soaking through his shirt. Not a mortal wound, I'd realized with a healer's assessment, but serious enough. A blade had caught him across the ribs, deep and vicious. 3 dead rogues had been sprawled across the marble floor, testament to how the fight had ended. But it was his eyes that had stopped me cold. He looked up as I'd entered, and in that moment of vulnerability King brought low, defenses shattered, mortality laid bare, something had ignited between us. The bond had crashed over me like a tidal wave. Every nerve ending had suddenly been alive with the knowledge of him. I'd felt his pain as if it were my own, felt the exhaustion ragging at his consciousness, felt the desperate relief flooding through him at the sight of me. And underneath it all, a connection so profound it had driven me to my knees beside him. Mate, my wolf had whispered with absolute certainty. Ours. Arya, he breathed. And I'd heard the same recognition in his voice, seen it blazing in his gray eyes. Let me help, I'd managed, though my hands had been shaking. The bond thrummed between us, demanding I touch him, heal him, make the pain stop. I pressed my hands against the wound, feeling the warmth of his blood, the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palms. The palace healers had arrived then, pushing through the crowd, but Valyrian had caught my wrist. Nail her. I want her. So I'd worked, drawing on every lesson my father had ever taught me, every technique I'd learned through years of being invisible but useful. The wound had been clean, the rogue's blade sharp, and I'd stitched it closed with steady hands while the bond sang between us, while his pain became mine and my determination to save him became his anchor. "You feel it," he'd said when I'd finally finished, his voice rough with emotion and residual pain. Yes, I'd met his eyes, my hand still pressed against the bandage covering his ribs. "I feel everything." The throne room had emptied at Gale's barked command, leaving us alone with the dead rogues and the blood-stained marble. Valerian had pulled me into his lap. Despite his injury, despite protocol, despite everything that said a king shouldn't be vulnerable. 7 years, he'd whispered against my hair. I waited 7 years believing I'd never feel this again, that the bond had judged me and found me unworthy of a second chance. "You're not unworthy," I'd said fiercely, careful not to jar his injury. "You've never been unworthy. You were just waiting like I was. For you?" His arms had tightened around me. "I was waiting for you and I didn't even know it." The implications had settled over both of us gradually. This wasn't just attraction or growing affection. This was fate itself declaring that we belonged together, that somehow, impossibly, the bond had chosen to give us both what we'd been missing. The council I'd started, but he'd silenced me with a kiss that tasted like blood and desperation and promise. "The council," he'd said when we'd finally broken apart, "will accept what I tell them to accept. You're my mate, Arya. Not a political alliance, not a strategic choice. My mate. And anyone who has a problem with that can challenge me directly." I'd laughed despite the tears streaming down my face. "You're injured. Maybe save the death threats for when you can actually stand." "I'll always stand for you," he replied with absolute certainty, "even when I'm on my knees." The following weeks had been a whirlwind of preparations and adjustments. The bond ceremony had been planned with a speed that left the council scrambling, but Valerian had been immovable. "I've waited 7 years," he told them flatly. "I won't wait another day longer than necessary." Vivian had come to the palace for the ceremony, not out of sisterly affection, but because refusing a king's invitation would have been politically disastrous. She'd looked at me with barely concealed envy, her perfect features tight with resentment. "I don't understand how you did it," she'd hissed during a brief moment alone. "You're nothing special, Arya. You never have been." For once, her words hadn't cut. I'd looked at my sister, beautiful, strong, everything a wolf was supposed to be, and felt only pity. "You're right," I'd said quietly. "I'm not special in the ways you value, but I'm exactly what he needed. And that's worth more than any amount of strength or status could ever be." The ceremony itself had been held in the palace gardens under a full moon, traditional but intimate. Only pack members Valerian trusted completely, only wolves who earned their place through loyalty rather than rank. Asa had stood beside me as my witness, her hand warm in mine, while Gale had stood for Valerian. When the time had come to recite the ancient vows, Valerian's voice had been steady despite the emotion I could feel thrumming through our bond. "I, Valerian Shadow, claim you, Arya Ashford, as my mate, my equal, my partner, my queen. I vow to protect you with my life, to honor you with my truth, to love you with everything I am. From this moment until my last breath, you are mine as I am yours." My own vows had come through tears. "I, Arya Ashford, accept your claim and offer my own. I choose you, Valerian Shadow, not for your crown or your power, but for the wolf beneath it all. I vow to stand beside you, to challenge you when you need it, to comfort you when you allow it. From this moment until my last breath, you are mine as I am yours." The bond had solidified as we'd sealed the vows with a kiss, and I'd felt it, the snap of completion, the sense of two souls recognizing they'd finally found home. Every wolf present had felt it too, the power of a true mating bond settling into place, and I'd heard the collective intake of breath, the whispered acknowledgement that this was real. That night, in the privacy of chambers that were now ours rather than just his, Valerian had held me close and whispered confessions into the darkness. "I used to dream about her," he'd said, his fingers tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. "About my first mate. I'd wake up and the loss would hit me all over again. But since you've been here, since the bond formed, I don't dream about her anymore. I dream about you, about our future, about the life we're going to build together. Does that make you feel guilty? I'd asked, understanding the complexity of loving someone new after loss. It did, at first, he'd admitted. But then I realized she would have wanted this for me, would have wanted me to be happy again, to love again. And loving you doesn't diminish what we had. It just means I was lucky enough to be chosen twice. I'd turned in his arms, meeting his eyes in the moonlight streaming through the windows. I'll spend every day proving I'm worth that choice. You already have, he'd replied, pulling me closer. Just by being exactly who you are. The months that followed had brought their own challenges. The rogues who'd attacked had been part of a larger group testing the territories, and Valerian had been forced to deal with them decisively. But now, when he left for patrols or negotiations, I felt him through the bond, his determination, his occasional frustration, the warm pulse of love that he sent back to me across whatever distance separated us. I'd taken on responsibilities as queen that surprised everyone, myself included. The Northern Pack's request for a healer had been the first. Garrett had asked specifically for my guidance in training someone from his pack. I'd spent 2 weeks there teaching everything I knew, and when I'd returned, 3 other packs had made similar requests. You're creating something, Asa had observed one afternoon while I'd organized supplies to send to the Eastern Territory. Her son, a healthy squalling baby boy named River, had been sleeping in a basket nearby. A network of healers across all the territories. Knowledge being shared instead of hoarded. Is that allowed? I'd asked, suddenly uncertain. I never asked permission, I just... It's brilliant, she'd interrupted firmly. And it's exactly what these territories need. You're not just the king's maid, Arya. You're becoming a queen in your own right. The council had come around eventually, though some more reluctantly than others. Darius had been the first to acknowledge that my influence had strengthened rather than weakened Valerian's rule. The packs trust you, he'd admitted grudgingly. They see you working with their healers, treating their children, and they remember that their king chose someone who cares about more than power. Even Vivian had eventually written a stiff, formal letter congratulating me on my position and asking if there might be opportunities for Silverpine wolves to train with the palace healer. I'd read between the lines. She was asking for help, for connection, for a way back into my life now that I was someone worth knowing. I'd written back with an invitation. Not because I'd forgotten her cruelty, but because I'd learned that strength sometimes meant being bigger than the wounds others had inflicted. A year after the bond had formed, Valerian had found me in the library, our library, as I now thought of it, reading through reports from the various healing stations I'd helped establish. Come with me, he'd said, offering his hand. I want to show you something. He'd led me through the palace and out to the northern woods, to the stream where we'd stopped on that first trip together. The sun had been setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the forest had been alive with evening sounds. Do you remember what you asked me here? He'd said, pulling me close. About whether I ever just ran for the joy of it? I remember. I'd smiled against his chest, breathing in his scent. Pine and snow and hope. I want to run with you, he'd whispered. Not as king and queen. Not with guards or protocol or duties weighing us down. Just us. Just 2 wolves who found each other against all odds. We'd shifted together, our wolves emerging in a synchronicity that the bond made effortless. His wolf was massive and dark, all coiled power and predatory grace. Mine was still small and silver-furred, still carried those 2 large eyes that had marked me as weak and Silverpine. But as we'd run through those woods together, his dark form matching pace with my lighter one, both of us finally free. I'd understood what I'd been too blind to see before. My supposed weakness had been my greatest strength all along. The gentleness that others had mistaken for fragility had been exactly what was needed to reach a king who'd forgotten how to be touched without flinching. The compassion that my pack had dismissed as useless had become the foundation of healing across 3 territories. The patience that had seemed like passivity had been what allowed me to wait for a love worth having. We'd run until the moon had risen full and bright, until we'd both been breathless and exhilarated, until we'd collapsed together in a clearing and shifted back to human form, tangled in each other's arms and laughing with pure joy. "I love you," Valerian had said, his gray eyes shining in the moonlight. "I loved you before the bond formed, and I'll love you long after we're both dust. You saved me, Arya. Saved me from a life where I was nothing but duty and darkness." "You saved me too," I'd replied, my fingers tracing the scar on his ribs from that attack. The wound that had brought the bond snapping into focus. "You taught me that being overlooked didn't mean I was worthless. That sometimes the right person sees exactly what everyone else missed." We'd lain there under the stars, two wolves who'd found their way home to each other. And I'd felt nothing but gratitude for every moment of pain and loneliness that had led me to this clearing, this man, this life. The overlooked daughter had become a queen. The cold king had learned to love again. And together we'd built something neither of us could have created alone. A future where strength and gentleness walked side by side, where power was tempered with compassion, where Tobruk wolves had found wholeness in each other. Years later, when I would sit with young wolves asking how I'd won the Lycan king's heart, I would always tell them the truth. I hadn't won anything. We'd simply recognized each other in a crowded hall to souls who understood what it meant to be alone, who knew the value of being truly seen. And when they'd ask what made me worthy of standing beside the most powerful wolf in the territories, I'd smile and give them the answer I'd learned through living it. I was brave enough to be myself even when everyone said that self wasn't enough. Sometimes that's the only worthiness that matters. The kingdom flourished. The territories found peace. Healers trained and knowledge spread. Children were born ours and others into a world where strength came in many forms. And through it all, Valerian and I remained what we'd been from that first moment in the library to wolves who'd chosen each other, who'd fought for each other, who'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely love is the one that changes everything. The overlooked daughter had found her voice. The lonely king had found his heart. And together, we'd built a legacy that would outlast us both, one of compassion, courage, and the revolutionary idea that true power isn't about dominance. It's about choosing love even when fear would be easier. Especially then.